Now, ladies and gentlemen, approaching are the trainers. All U.S. military pilots completed a training program that was accomplished in 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. These future aviation warriors learned to fly in a wide variety of aircraft, among them the Grasshoppers, the L-Birds, like the Aranca's L-16 Champ, the Piper L-4, better known as the Piper Cub. Here they come now.
Ladies and gentlemen, those in the plaza standing, please kneel down or find a seat so you're not blocking the view of people behind you. Thank you.
In addition to serving as training aircraft, all of these planes had wartime functions as observation, reconnaissance, and liaison aircraft. One Army Air Force pilot recorded 6 confirmed kills of German tanks while flying a Piper L-4 Grasshopper outfitted with a bazooka. These 2 aircraft flying over a part of that L-bird gaggle. All nicknamed Grasshoppers and all having a top speed of a blistering 90 to 95 miles an hour. All U.S. military pilots completed a training program that was accomplished in 3 phases. Primary, basic, and advanced. This process was designed to gradually increase the complexity of a pilot's training. You don't have to go. One of the iconic trainers was the Boeing Stearman biplane, an open cockpit aircraft constructed of wood, fabric, and tubular steel. There were more than 24 different variants of the Stearman and more than 10,000 built. Used also by the RCAF, it earned another well-known nickname, the Cadet. These are the Stearman biplanes. Primary training introduced cadets to the principles of flight. Basic training introduced them to the complexities of radio communication and flying in formation. And advanced training was designed to prepare the air crews to go into combat. Another primary trainer was the Fairchild PT-19, a monoplane that was used by the Army Air Forces, the British Royal Air Force, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Like the Stearman, the PT-19 was an open cockpit design. Advanced training was accomplished in aircraft like the North American AT-6 Texan, weighing in at nearly 3 tons with a 600 horsepower radial engine and retractable landing gear. The T-6 was designed to prepare pilots to fly state-of-the-art aircraft that they would use in combat. By the end of the war, North American aviation had built more than 15,000 Texans, including the AT-6 variant for the Army Air Forces and the SNJ version for the U.S. Navy. When World War II began, the Bendix Corporation was a big name in aviation. The company built radios for both the B-29 Mitchell bomber and the P-40 Warhawk fighter. Bendix also manufactured the ball turrets for the B-25. The company is now Bendix King, which is a part of Honeywell Aviation, one of our sponsors of the Arsenal of Democracy flyover. There was perhaps no single company that made a bigger contribution to America's success in World War II in the air than the Grumman Corporation. Grumman designed and built the F-4F Wildcat and the F-6F Hellcat fighters and the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, all planes that were essential to our country's success in naval battles in the Pacific. In 1994, the company merged with Northrop Corporation to form Northrop Grumman, a lead sponsor of today's Arsenal of Democracy flyover. We'll see several Grumman planes in the formation flyovers today. When the Triumph Group acquired Vought Aircraft Industries several years ago, they acquired a part of aviation and World War II history. Chance Vought built the F4U Corsair, a critical tool in the war against Japan, and after several name changes and acquisitions, the company that was once Chance Vought is now part of the Triumph Group, a sponsor of today's flyover. General Electric Company was a vital part of the American Arsenal of Democracy. In addition to groundbreaking research and development of the first jet engine designed in the United States, GE pioneered the development and integration of turbochargers into aircraft engines. Many thanks to GE for also being a sponsor of today's flyover. In just a moment, the T-6 flight will be coming over. The Texans, also used by the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force, they called it the Harvard. It was indeed an aircraft of higher learning. Here come the Texans, the 600 horsepower, 2 flights of 4. Listen to the sound that they make as they go over. There were also multi-engine trainers. One was known as the AT-11 Kansan, built by Beechcraft. Also had a light cargo designation of C-45. The Twin Beech, as it was known in civilian life, also served many functions, including as a training platform for bombing, navigation, and gunnery. With 2 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines, it'll have a great sound all its own. Look over the memorial, it's inbound now. Ladies and gentlemen, the AT-11, the Twin Beech. Inbound right now are 2 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, a 1937 design that at the time of Pearl Harbor was our #1 fighter in the Pacific. Directly to our left, the 2 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks with Allison V12 engines in them, liquid-cooled. In April of 1942, after a series of stinging setbacks in the Pacific, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers off the USS Hornet on a bombing raid to Tokyo and 4 other cities. The raid was American improvisation at its finest. The B-25 wasn't designed to fly from an aircraft carrier, and an American strike on the heartland of Japan so soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor provided Americans with a much-needed boost in morale. Although the raid resulted in only minor damage to its targets, it had a profound impact on Japanese strategy, causing military leaders to be more concerned about attacks on Japan than they otherwise would be. The two surviving Doolittle raiders, Dick Cole and Dave Thatcher, commemorated the 73rd anniversary of the raid just last month. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 B-25 Mitchell bombers, 2 of them B-25s, one actually in Marine Corps PBJ-1 livery. In early June of 1942, as the Japanese and American navies converged on a tiny volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in the momentum of the Pacific theater. Tipped off to Japanese plans by U.S. cryptographers who had broken Japanese radio codes, PBY Catalina flying boats were deployed from Midway Island to search hundreds of miles of ocean for enemy ships. One of them found the Japanese fleet steaming toward Midway and radioed the information to American military planners. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the PBY Catalina. From 3 U.S. carriers, Wildcat fighters flew escort for slower Devastator and Dauntless bombers, but logistical problems and bad luck plagued Americans as they began their attack. Most of the American torpedo bombers were shot out of the sky. In the first 3 hours of the battle, not a single U.S. bomb or torpedo hit a Japanese ship, despite 8 separate attacks by a total of 94 airplanes. Then the tide turned. As the Japanese focused their attention on the torpedo bombers flying just off the surface of the water, SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked from a higher altitude, fatally damaging 3 of 4 Japanese carriers. An hour later, a second attack by dive bombers destroyed the 4th Japanese carrier. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. We're right now awaiting the SBD Dauntlesses and the FM2 Wildcats. Wildcats were designed by Grumman as the F4F, but were also produced in great numbers by General Motors under the designation FM2 Wildcat. The Wildcat and the Dauntless. When the U.S. Marines stormed the shores of Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Japanese conquests had reached their peak. This bold, unexpected offensive would prove to be a critical turning point in the war in the Pacific. A small but strategic airfield on the island was the focal point of 6 months of fierce battles on the ground, in the air, and on the sea. And by the time the Japanese conceded the island in February of 1943, nearly 25,000 Japanese and 1,600 Americans had been killed, with thousands more dead from malaria and other tropical diseases. Central to the battle was the venerable Grumman F4F Wildcat, which operated from carriers by U.S. Navy pilots and from Henderson Field by Marine Corps pilots throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Although badly outmatched by the faster and more agile Mitsubishi Zero, the Wildcats of Guadalcanal's Cactus Air Force were able to hold their own because of their rugged construction and the unique battle tactics developed by the naval aviators who flew them. By the end of 1943, the first Grumman F6F Hellcats, a new and far superior Grumman fighter, were being deployed to the Pacific theater. But during the early critical battles in the Pacific in 1942 and 43, it was the Wildcat that shouldered the burden as America's principal carrier-based fighter. The Wildcats that you'll see here today are both the FM2 variant built by General Motors during the last years of the war and deployed on smaller escort carriers for anti-submarine and picket duty. Interestingly, pilots of the Wildcats have told me that rather than flipping a switch to raise the landing gear, after they took off, they maintained about 90 or 95 miles an hour, put their left hand on the stick instead of the right hand, and took the right hand and had to crank the landing gear up 29 turns to get it up. It was not a fun airplane in the pattern. Ladies and gentlemen, here come the Wildcats. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet and mastermind behind Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. In the spring of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decoded a message with Yamamoto's itinerary for an airplane trip between two islands in the Solomon Islands area of the South Pacific. On April 18th, a flight of 18 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings was dispatched from Cookham Field on Guadalcanal on a long, low-altitude circuitous route designed to evade enemy radar and maximize the element of surprise. Here comes the fork-tailed devil, the P-38 Lightning, which shot down Yamamoto's plane. The mission named Operation Vengeance not only avenged the deaths of 2,400 Americans at Pearl Harbor, but it also deprived the Japanese of one of their finest military strategists. Known as Hitler's gas station, Ploiesti was a huge complex of Romanian oil refineries that supplied Germany with more than one-third of its fuel. After identifying it as a high-priority target, military strategists initially opted for a single large raid by B-24 bombers attacking from an altitude of just 200 feet. Flying the mission at low altitude would help the Americans avoid enemy radar and increase the accuracy of their bombs, but the low altitude would also put the aircraft and crews at greater risk. The B-24 was selected for the mission because it was the only U.S. bomber that could manage the 2,400-mile round trip from Libya to Ploiesti and back. Though complex and finicky to fly and maintain, the U.S. produced more B-24 bombers than any other. And in 1944, assembly lines rolled out a new one every 58 minutes at plants in San Diego, Fort Worth, Tulsa, and Detroit. But the Americans lost nearly a third of their bombers and 500 airmen during that low-level raid on August 1st of 1943. So military leaders adopted a new strategy of daily raids from a higher altitude with long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustangs, incrementally destroying Ploiesti's production capacity over a period of 14 months. As attacks on the oil refineries of Romania continued during the summer of 1944, American forces pushed into France. Army Air Forces Commander General Hap Arnold noted the increasing number of vehicles along the side of the road that had just run out of gas. Here's the Liberator with the Mustangs. In the early days of the war, after the Allies had decided that the British would conduct nighttime bombing raids on German targets and the Americans would bomb during daylight hours, mission losses were horrific. Without fighter escorts, the U.S. bombers in particular suffered unsustainable losses to German fighters and anti-aircraft flak. By some estimates, The fatality rate of B-17 and B-24 crews was put at nearly 50%. That began to change with the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range fighter. When outfitted with external fuel tanks made of a kind of paper mache, here come the Mustangs. Mustangs also flown by the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tail Squadron of the Tuskegee Airmen. By 1944, the German Air Force was struggling to survive. In a single week that February, the Allies sought to hasten the end. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, was a series of large-scale Royal Air Force and U.S. bombing raids on German aviation factories. On several raids, more than 1,000 bombers were sent against their targets. Together, the Allies dropped over 20 million pounds of ordnance between February 20th and February 25th. The raids were also intended to bait German fighters into the air, where nearly 900 P-47 and P-51 Mustangs engaged them. The German Air Force lost a third of its remaining single-engine fighters that month, and 18% of its pilots. But U.S. forces suffered as well. In more than 3,000 sorties, 247 B-17s were lost, despite the bombers' almost uncanny ability to withstand damage and bring our airmen home. Outfitted with 13 .50 caliber machine guns in 8 different locations on the plane, the 10-member crews of the B-17 flew this aircraft, earning the nickname Flying Fortress, with the ability to fly long distances with a bomb payload of about 6,000 pounds. These 4-engine aircraft were the workhorse of America's strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Four 1,200 horsepower motors allowed the B-17 to lumber at high altitudes, but it was not a pressurized aircraft. When they had to fly up where it was cold, literally, crew members wore suits that had electric wires in them to keep them warm. They wore oxygen masks, and they would come back from missions with marks on their faces from frostbite that was created from being such high altitude and such low temperatures. In all, over 12,700 B-17s were built, remaining flying today anywhere in the world, somewhere around a dozen. It's part of the reason that we love to see these airplanes fly. So few are still in existence today. The P-51 Mustang long-range fighters had a production total of somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000, and about 160 are still flyable around the world today. Now, we're still waiting for the 2 B-17 bombers that will be coming across here very, very shortly. They were part of our heavy bomber fleet along with the B-24 Liberator we saw fly by earlier. There were about 18,000 B-24 Liberators made, more than any other American aircraft during the war. Here come the first B-17, and the second, The Flying Fortress, 10 crew members in each aircraft. The first Allied soldiers in France on D-Day arrived by parachute just after midnight on June 6, 1944. 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions made the trip in more than 800 C-47 transport aircraft. These lead elements jumped into Normandy to secure a series of bridges, causeways, and crossroads vital to the success of the Allied invasion of France. The C-47 began its life as the Douglas DC-3, an airplane credited with revolutionizing the airline industry. And with the outbreak of hostilities, the plane was reconfigured as a military transport. C-47s kept in China in the war flew supplies, fuel, and weapons and personnel from muddy airfields in India across the Himalayan range to bases in China. It was called flying the hump. After D-Day, the C-47 supported the Allied drive into Germany, including flying critical resupply missions to surrounded U.S. forces during the Battle of the Bulge. Here comes the C-47. After 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower credited 4 weapons to winning the war: the bazooka, the jeep, the atomic bomb, and the C-47. About 11,000 of those were built, and about 1,100 remain flyable around the world today, some with turbine conversions on their engines. The June 19, 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. In a flotilla that included 15 aircraft carriers and more than 100 supporting ships, the U.S. Navy arrived to capture the island of Saipan for use as a base for B-29 Superfortresses to bomb Japan. By nightfall on the 19th, Japan had lost 2/3 of the 400 carrier aircraft it had committed to the battle. One Hellcat pilot shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in less than 8 minutes. American losses were 29 aircraft plus a nominal damage to a single battleship. The superiority of U.S. pilots was so dramatic that the battle came to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle also included the loss of 11 Japanese ships, including 3 aircraft carriers. The U.S. Navy aircraft attacked enemy ships with Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, and the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. What you will see here today are 2 TBM torpedo bombers and a single Curtiss Helldiver, the only Helldiver of over 7,000 built that's still flying today. The battle was decisive and eliminated the Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations, giving the U.S. a new level of naval dominance that lasted until the end of the war.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 special guests with us today, 2 special statesmen. 2 veterans, Senator Robert Dole and Senator Warner. They're in the front row. Let's hear it for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, here come the 2 TBM Avengers and the Curtiss Helldiver, nicknamed the Big-Tailed Beast. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive campaign in World War II. It began in mid-December of 1944 as a surprise attack on American forces in the Ardennes area of Belgium. Before it was over, the battle would involve more than 500,000 Germans, 600,000 Americans, and 50,000 British troops. Characterized initially by cold temperatures and overcast skies, the battle demonstrated how thoroughly air support had been integrated into contemporary military operations. The Allies' inability to dominate the skies over the battlefield prolonged the German offensive, and conversely, the return of air support helped the Allies achieve victory in the battle. It began on December 16th with a German attack designed to catch the Allies unaware and split their forces in half. The Germans wanted to capture the Belgian harbor of Antwerp. That initial offensive against unprepared American defenses created a large 80-mile-wide bulge in the Allied lines. One of the aircraft that drove the Germans back was the A-26 Invader, built by Douglas. Immortalized forever by the photo of Marines raising the U.S. flag over Mount Suribachi, the Battle of Iwo Jima helped to secure 3 airfields and provided the United States with an important staging area for the much-anticipated invasion of the Japanese homeland. It is a testament to the ferocity of the fighting on Iwo Jima that more than 25,000 U.S. Marines were killed or wounded during 35 days of fighting in February and March of 1945. And nearly 19,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. The only battle of the war in which U.S. casualties exceeded Japanese. The chance-fought F4U Corsair was critical to the American success on Iwo Jima. Initially designed as a carrier-based fighter, the pilot sat far back in the fuselage, and his view was restricted because of the 2,000-horsepower motor, the 13-foot-plus diameter propeller, and a huge fuel tank, making landings extremely challenging on the pitching deck of a carrier. So early models went to land-based Marine pilots who put the aircraft's speed and heavy armament to effective use in both dogfights and ground support. Eventually, Corsair pilots shot down 11 Japanese aircraft for every Corsair lost, and by the beginning of 1945, Marine Corps pilots were flying low-level missions with bombs, rockets, and napalm in support of their fellow Marines on the beaches and in the jungles of the small islands throughout the South Pacific, including Iwo Jima. The Japanese called this airplane Whistling Death. Some of you remember VMA 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, led by Pappy Boyington. They called him Pappy because he was older than the rest of the guys in the squadron. He was 28. He also racked up 28 kills during his career. Ladies and gentlemen, from the right and directly in front of you all, here come the F4U Corsair, the bent wing bird. The B-29 Superfortress, built by Boeing, could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs and targets to more than 2,000 miles away. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, it was able to fly above most of Japan's home island defenses. Instead of conventional gun turrets, the B-29's weapons poked from sealed blisters on the fuselage, linked through a remote control system that was a marvel of technology in the 1940s. By the time B-29s entered the war, an earlier generation of heavy bombers had leveled much of Germany, so the super forces were deployed to China and later to Tinian in the Marianas Islands. The move to the islands put the aircraft to within 1,500 miles of Tokyo, well within the bombers' range. With their large numbers and vast payloads, it wasn't long before the B-29s had destroyed nearly every strategic target in Japan. The only aircraft then capable of delivering the world's first nuclear bombs, modified superforces joined their standard comrades on Tinian in the early summer of 1945. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar destroyed Nagasaki with a plutonium bomb. On August 14th, Japanese surrendered unconditionally. The surrender was formalized in a ceremony on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd of 1945. Compared to the 12,000 plus B-17s and 18,000 plus Liberators that were built, production of the B-29 Superfortress was about 4,000. It was rushed into service. It was fraught with engine problems so great that engines were routinely swapped out after only 25 hours of flying time. Just shy of 4,000 B-29 Superfortresses were built by Boeing and also by Bell. And also Martin aircraft. The ability for the B-29 to fly at such high altitudes is because it was the first U.S. aircraft that was pressurized, enabling the aircrew to be operating the aircraft in normal kinds of temperatures. Ladies and gentlemen, here comes the B-29. Over 12 million Americans answered the nation's call over the course of the Second World War. We are going to have now what is known as a missing man formation. It serves to remind us of those who sacrificed their future for that of our nation, and it's a tradition which dates back to World War II. The symbolic moment when a single aircraft breaks formation and soars skyward, leaving behind his comrades in arms. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please help us recognize our fallen heroes and stand while Taps is being played. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. Thanks to the Texas Flying Legends for performing the missing man formation. 70 years ago, the world rejoiced, ladies and gentlemen. London's Trafalgar Square was the scene of an immense impromptu street party. Joyful Frenchmen celebrated on the Champs-Élysées in Paris.